there were a couple high-profile instances of like big tech deplatforming or limiting different voices over the last couple weeks. And we're going to talk about each of them and also the issue kind of more broadly. The first one was that Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, I'm not a fan, she is like this very far-right QAnon conspiracy in her past, very, very kind of one of the most extreme members of Congress in the GOP. Yeah, Hannah?
She is the GOP's AOC. That is the best way to sum it up.
Yes, fair. So she was permanently banned, her personal account, not her official account, from Twitter for quote-unquote COVID misinformation, which is a tricky subject we'll get into in a sec. Then there was also a doctor who is kind of an outlier voice on COVID vaccines and other things. Robert Malone, who played a small part in the invention of mRNA vaccines, but now he's talked a lot about some anti-vax stuff that fact checkers have a lot of problems with. And then the third big instance that's made a lot of headlines is a children's book series published by my friend Bethany Mandel, featuring like children's books about American heroes like Thomas Sowell, the famous African-American free market economist, and then like Clarence Thomas and other kind of conservative American history people, was blocked from Facebook advertising, which they had made a huge part of their marketing strategy and invested a ton of money because people were reporting their children's books as like hateful and harmful content. So I think we kind of run the gamut there of like instances of censorship that are kind of concerning, other ones that seem more justified, but that's why everybody's talking about it right now. So Hannah, I'll just toss it to you for your initial thoughts on those cases.
Yeah, so my initial thought, which I tweeted and kind of took off over the past couple of days, was that I would rather live in a country where politicians can be kicked off private property than one where they can't. And so do I like that these websites are kicking off politicians? No, mostly I don't. I would say I still think it's better to have free, open discourse. But there is like a very spunky part of me that's like, suck it, politicians. Like, you don't get to say where you get to be in this country. And that's just revolutionary. That's still revolutionary throughout most of the world right now. That is simply not true. And so I do think that there is like that element there. I also understand the issues that a lot of people have with big tech. At least I understand them on the right. But I don't think people see is, since I'm kind of squarely here, sort of in the middle, is that the people on the left have just as many issues with big tech as well. And their reasoning for it is because they actually want you to be censored more. And what the right seems to just be missing, because they don't know how to play chess, is that the same solutions they keep pushing because they think they're being censored too much are the solutions that the people on the left are pushing because they know it will actually help them censor you more. So I get really frustrated in these discussions because I think that there is kind of a knee-jerk reaction to some of these things happening that is not strategic, that actually is counterintuitive to free market and civil liberties beliefs. And so I get kind of annoyed. And I also think that it is a bit overblown because as much as we're going to dig into this right now, these are 3 anecdotal stories in a country of 330 million on platforms that host billions of people. And when somebody does get kicked off, it's usually major news. It's all over the place. I've done some digging to see like how true is it that conservatives are being censored? Because it is true that you don't usually hear of a Democrat politician being kicked off. It is true that Twitter will allow the CCP or North Korean leaders or the Taliban to stay online and kick off Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. But like, come on now. And
it's not worse than ISIS and the Taliban.
Right.
And they're on there.
And if she's spreading COVID misinformation, well, like, what about the CDC? What about the teachers' unions? What about half these Democratic pundits who ran around saying a bunch of BS for the past 2 years that actually led to very damaging outcomes, actually got people killed? They're still on there. So I understand that sentiment, but I do want to read a little data because I did some digging. And I will say that it is a little bit overblown. You've got this research that just came out of New York University that looked into this. And they found that platforms actually promote the voices of many right-leaning conservators, commentators more so. They said Republicans or more broadly conservatives have been spreading a form of disinformation on how they're treated on social media. They complain they're censored and suppressed, but not only is there not evidence to support that, what evidence does exist actually cuts in the other direction. And then Twitter itself did some digging and some reporting recently, and they had to come out and admit that their algorithm actually was biased towards conservatives. They were found to amplify tweets from right-wing politicians more than those on the left. And then lastly, research from 2020 found that conservative pages beat left-leaning pages in terms of engagement. We can post those links in our show notes so you can dig into them yourself. So I just want to say that it is a bit overblown, but again, it doesn't mean that there's no issue here at all.
Yeah, and I want to respond to some of that because I think I agree with your basic premise. We agree on a few premises, which is number one, these platforms have the legal right. Now, we might think it's immoral or wrong or sus and not like it, but we acknowledge that Twitter is private property. It is the property of Twitter, and they have the legal right, the First Amendment right to kick people off of it. In fact, forcing them to allow politicians on their platform would be very dubious constitutionally under the First Amendment. So whether what they're doing is ethical, I am much, much more concerned about. And I largely don't think so, but I do agree, right? A lot of right-wing commentators, one in particular who interacted with you and I recently, referred to social media censorship, the state of it, as like socio-corporate tyranny is the state of online discourse right now because it's controlled by the big tech oligarchs that enforce, woke orthodoxy or whatever. And that to me is extremely, extremely hyperbolic and just doesn't describe reality. You do have, Ben Shapiro having like the most popular Facebook page around. People like you and I do very well on social media. I mean, Fox News, etc. That said, though, and I think something these studies sometimes miss is a couple things. One, you just have to look at the high-profile incidents, and they all almost always cut one way. Trump is banned, but crazy left-wing politicians who've incited violence are not. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene is banned, but Ilhan Omar is not. And she's posted, anti-Semitic conspiracies and all sorts of things. The New York Post's information story about Hunter Biden that was supposedly disinformation and turned out to be true, that was censored by all of these companies. Turned out, A, nothing was wrong with it, and B, these companies never censored all the New York Times disinformation about Russia hoaxes, right? And even on YouTube, I have to say, on YouTube is probably the worst offender. Yes. There's very clear censorship of conservative content, and not actually as much censorship as much as they sharply demonetize a ton of conservative content. And then on TikTok, oh my God, it is owned by a commie nation, so like nation state. So what do you expect? But they are very unfair to the right on there. And so I will say, I don't fully agree with some of these studies' conclusions. I agree the narrative is overwrought. However, some of these places, for example, will look like, for NewsWhip, they'll look at or CrowdTangle, these different social media aggregators. They'll look at Facebook and they'll say, actually, Facebook is good for conservatives because if you look at the top 10 pages, more of the biggest ones are right-wing voices. Well, if you zoom out and look at the top 500, it's not quite so biased. In fact, the truth is that there are a few conservative influencers like Ben Shapiro, Dan Bongino, and Fox News that explode because they're really some of the only large accounts that are right-wing on Facebook. Then there's a ton of like liberal outlets and everything and influencers that are on there. So it's just more dispersed, and that data can be kind of more nuanced. So I do agree that it's not nearly as bad as the right says. But I'm very sympathetic to the narrative that these companies are unfair in their censorship, and it mostly runs one way, and that's against the right.
Yeah, I think when you do, like I said earlier, when you do see these anecdotal things come out, it is always cutting one way. I still think they're few and far between, but it's cutting them one way. And I think some platforms are worse than others. Certainly YouTube is the worst. And I think that when you look at things like Facebook, you also have to take into account how much money people spend to be seen. I have a page that's almost entirely organic. I think I've maybe run an ad once or twice in my entire history of being on Facebook. And I have tens of thousands of followers, and I get great viewership on there. And I've mostly been able to do that without paying them. That's kind of an anomaly. Most people have to spend a pretty good chunk of change to be
Shapiro spends millions on Facebook ads.
Yeah. People have
of course he has good engagement.
Right. It's like you're seeing a lot of them because they're paying a lot of money. So, I mean, there are a lot of factors that come into play here. And again, it's not to say there's nothing wrong with big tech. I think that what we need to look at, though, is what the root causes of the problem are. And it's that government has propped up big tech. You would not see these companies have grown as large as they have. You wouldn't see them have such a large percentage of market share, which, again, I'll point out is not quite what you think. Twitter's barely in the top 10 of top platforms. It doesn't matter as much as people feel like it matters when they're on Twitter. But all that being said, we have some crony schemes that have come about. And as true free market capitalists, we preach against these things. We preach against subsidies, all subsidies. We preach against corporate welfare. We preach against regulations. And so when we see the terrible ramifications of these policies come to fruition, which is what we currently have, where there's not as much competition as we would like in the market, though there is still plenty of competition, and where we do see the government increasingly using the threat of regulations to pressure companies to moderate more, that's all highly problematic. My issue with conservatives and even like a small kind of faction of libertarians that like tend to kind of think more along conservative lines sometimes is they're saying this thing I'm seeing online where they'll say, well, because these companies took corporate welfare, that makes them private company or makes them public companies, and like basically wanting to nationalize these companies. It's like, hold on. You just went the whole other opposite direction of the way you should have been going, which is to remove these kinds of regulations and the ability for the government to mess with the free market. Secondarily, that's not factually legal or right. True on free speech grounds. Like bad legal takes on Twitter has been busy the past couple days.
Taking food stamps doesn't mean you lose your First Amendment rights as a person. And so the same way, I don't support corporate welfare, but the fact that companies take it doesn't mean they lose their rights legally. That is kind of crazy talk. And it's actually like very left-wing talk. It's very like
left-wing.
There's this gross overlap between like right-wing nat cons and like leftist socialists on these issues. And I'm like, shouldn't that be your first sign, people on the right who support this, that this isn't going to help you? Everyone wants to talk on the right, wants to talk about like modifying Section 230 or even repealing it, some people want. And for those that don't know, Hannah's done a whole based episode on Section 230 that you can check out. But it's not that simple at all, because Section 230, were you to meddle with it, would actually lead to more censorship, not less. It's a liability shield. And it's pretty telling that Facebook supports meddling. I get their ads all the time. We've talked about this before on the pod, that they want to meddle with Section 230, because if they put up a big regulatory barrier that will block small startups that don't have armies of lawyers, that actually protects their dominance on their increasingly outdated platform from more competition, like TikTok, like Twitter, though they're actually a smaller competitor than people think. And so it's just not, even when I agree with the right and conservatives on the big tech problem somewhat, and I'm very sympathetic to the things they're feeling and expressing, then I look at their policy proposals and I'm like, those are all terrible. They would just make everything worse.
Mm-hmm. It would make everything worse. And ultimately, again, they need to think 3 steps ahead. That's all I'm asking here. Like,
much to ask.
Pay attention, please, and quit selling out your values. Like the idea that we want to nationalize these companies, you're mad that the government is maybe pressuring them to censor you, and so your solution is to make them government owned. Like, what is wrong with you? That's not even excusable. Like, something's wrong. Like, that doesn't. I just want you to go from point 1 to 2, okay? Point 1 to 2. We don't even need to take it 3 to 4 steps down the road. Point 1 to 2 is all we need. It makes no sense. Again, these are things that are counterintuitive to free market beliefs. They are totally antithetical to the Constitution, to civil liberties, and it just actually gets under my skin because I expect it from the left. I expect them to not stand for these things, but when I see the right so quickly get hoodwinked and sell out their values, the minute they just even think that maybe one of their posts is not being seen by as many people as it could be, they're willing to sell out the entire infrastructure that we believe in because of that. It's infuriating.
It's really cheap. It's very unprincipled. And it's also just dumb. I mean, if your plan, some of these conservative senators, in air quotes, who have this anti-big tech legislation, they literally say, we need to empower the FTC to enforce conservative free speech. And I'm like, sir, stop. The average federal bureaucrat has the politics of Elizabeth Warren. If you think empowering the deep state the entrenched federal bureaucracy is going to help conservative speech online, I have a bridge to sell you. And also, you need to lay off the heroin because you're absolutely high out of your mind, and you have totally lost the plot. So these people, it's like, I think they just like being edgelordy and radical, maybe, but they're endorsing these policy solutions in the biggest air quotes possible that would actually lead to them being censored more. So I lose sympathy for them at that point.
Yeah, it's two things. One, they have come to hate their enemies more than they actually love freedom. That's the biggest problem right then and there. The second problem is that they make this ever-present narcissistic error where they think that the only problem with power is that they're the ones not yielding it. And they think that as soon as they're in power, they're the ones writing the legislation, they're the ones enacting the regulations, that things will cut their way. And it's just quite foolish. It's ignorant of history. It's ignorant of human nature. And again, look at who the person who runs the FTC right now is a socialist. And I don't even mean like cute little AOC socialist. I mean like somebody who knows what she's doing, and gonna get it done. You should be really concerned that these people are trying to hand these agencies more power. That should be a lot more concerning than big tech. You don't have to use big tech. You can get away from big tech if you want to. And again, there's plenty of competitors you could go to. The problem is most people still want to use Facebook and Twitter because most people like their experience on Facebook and Twitter, but it is a product that they let you use. You don't have to use it. Giving the government that kind of authority and power actually can harm you, actually can coerce you, actually can have real consequences in your daily life. So people have got to get their priorities in line here.
Yeah, I will say, though, companies are not making it any easier for themselves. They clearly are echo chambers. And when they do crazy things like censor these anodyne children book series, it really shows that they've only got liberal-leaning people in there, and it's an echo chamber, and they make some very bad content decisions. So they need to hire a more diversity of views at these companies, and they need to enact principles and policies that actually follow through on the things they promised people, which was never free and unfettered speech. They always had terms of services. You're not going to be allowed to deny the Holocaust and threaten people and post terrorist propaganda or dox people. But they did promise people that they would be robust platforms for open debate and discourse. And increasingly, I think they are failing to live up to those promises. And if companies want to get out of the way, instead of rushing to Congress and begging them to put up walls to protect their interests with crony regulations, they could just start actually living up to what they promised people. And sure, some crazies on the far right and far left would still hate them, but there wouldn't be so much, I think, unanimous distrust and dislike for these companies.
Yeah, I agree. And I actually think you just brought up a really interesting point we don't talk about enough, but so often these decisions are algorithm decisions, right? It's not somebody sitting there looking for conservatives trying to weed them out. It's an algorithm that's been programmed. And when you don't have a diversified workforce that's building that algorithm, that actually naturally gets factored in. I have a friend in New York City who works in AI, and her only job at her company is working with AI to ensure it doesn't end up being sexist and racist, because so much of what AI takes in is what's already out there on the web. And so they have to be very careful with how they train these types of technologies so that we don't get these biased algorithms. And it sounds like maybe Facebook and Twitter could use some help in that area.